On the Canadian prairies, a local resident makes his way to work on a cool spring morning. Along an abandoned road in the outskirts of the city, he spots a motionless figure face down in the ditch. He hurries off to call police.
I got called at 7:13 in the morning from our telecoms people advising that a body had been found in the ditch. The body was about 20 feet off the roadway in the north ditch. I noticed blood around the head and the arm and in the ditch. I didn't know the sex of the person because the body was face down. I knew something was wrong simply because there was no vehicle in the area. It wasn't a motor vehicle accident. With the blood on the body and in the ditch, I knew this wasn't good. It appeared to be suspicious to me.
Within the hour, a forensic team is on the scene. The deceased appears to be a woman in her late 20s or early 30s of Aboriginal descent. While it seems like a clear case of foul play, her identity and exact cause of death remain a mystery.
Any potential evidence that was found, we would mark it with a number, photograph it, and then collect that. That evidence then would be placed in a container of some sort and handed over to the exhibit person.
Police find empty .22 shells in the vicinity. Over 50 strands of hair are also recovered. Most intriguing, recent prints are discovered on the road and ditch. Prints that may have been left behind by a murderer fleeing the scene.
I could see tire tracks right close to the body. It had rained a fair bit that night, so the tire tracks were very distinct. Right away, I thought perhaps that this could be the tire tracks of a suspect vehicle.
When we found the tire print at the scene, then we decided that it was suitable for comparison purposes. We'd take it down, make a concoction of polyresin, take the polyresin, pour it into the imprint, let it set, remove that, and then it was suitable for comparison.
Numerous shoe prints also turn up in the soft ground, prints left by someone other than the victim. Hoping to find more evidence and possibly a murder weapon, police expand the search outwards.
Just slightly north of the body was a slough, so we decided to pump out the slough to check for any potential evidence. Often people in these types of situations will panic and throw things into water, so it was important for us to pump out that slough.
Anytime you go to a crime scene, you want to make sure you gather all the evidence that you possibly can. You only have one chance to gather the evidence.
The drained slough yields no new clues, nor do any turn up along the long stretch of abandoned road.
Basically what we do is we walk up and down the ditches looking for any potential evidences. People leaving the scene may throw something out the window. I also attended to a farmyard which was close to where the scene is to see if they had heard or seen anything that night, but unfortunately they hadn't. You know, although it is close to the city, it is somewhat isolated, the area.
By afternoon, at least part of the mystery is solved. Fingerprints identify the victim as 28-year-old Pamela George, originally from the Sakamay First Nation, located an hour and a half from the city. Pamela is the mother of 2 young children. Her mother, Ina, is the first to learn of the horrible news.
Pamela was my firstborn. She was cute and she really helped me a lot as she was growing up. She was a good girl.
I've always, in my mind, I always thought my mom was the best from when I was little. And I always told myself I wanted to be like my mom.
And we heard on the radio that they found a body on Pinky Road. They told me it was Pamela that they found. And I was in a shock and I just more or less burst out crying. But I just didn't believe it.
An autopsy exposes the horrific way in which Pamela died. Unexpectedly, the 22 shells found at the scene appear to be unrelated to the crime. Pamela was instead the victim of an intense physical beating. Along with numerous cuts and bruises on her face, she has a broken nose and likely died from internal bleeding in her brain. More strands of hair are recovered during the autopsy, 6 from her right hand and 2 from her left. At first glance, they are consistent with Pamela's own hair, as are the ones recovered from the scene. As they struggle to protect themselves, victims undergoing intense struggle will often pull out some of their own hair. Meanwhile, news of the violent and mysterious crime makes headlines in the small city.
Well, Regina is a small city where people know each other and know their neighbors. It's a small community. And I think anytime you have a homicide in this city, it's front page news. But this one in particular was the first one of the year. You had a body found on the edge of the city, and that's a concern for people. I think Regina really has 2 sides or 2 worlds to it. On the one side, we have the suburbs, largely Caucasian people, middle class, upper class. On the other side, you have the inner city and a lot of people that are Aboriginal and live with a lot of poverty and despair.
Pamela was from the inner city, a part of Regina east of downtown, which is called the core area. And that area is plagued by drug abuse, poverty, and prostitution. And so when people found out that's where she came from, I think a lot of people just assumed, well, I don't have to worry about it. It's not my world. It was probably one bad person killing another insignificant person.
Police learned that Pamela often worked the streets as one of the inner city neighborhood's many sex trade workers. Hoping to shed light on the crime, they try to trace her last steps.
The primary investigator who was in charge of the whole investigation put us into teams of 2 and had assigned us tasks. I was teamed up with Constable Chuck Appleton. Our first task was to head down to the core area of Regina and make inquiries with people who were down there. This was the last place that Pam George was seen alive. It's a poor area. It's very narrow, dark streets, older houses, very dark at night. It's frequented by prostitutes and drug dealers who hang out in the area. We were both in plain clothes. We were driving an unmarked police car. We started by seeing the girls on the corner. We had approached them and asked them to come over, told them why we were there and who we were, and asked them to tell us if they'd seen anything suspicious on the night that Pamela George went missing.
We talked to all kinds of people in this area, those who suffered from drug and alcohol abuse, and even those who were involved in their own illegal activity. And often they didn't want to talk to us because they thought we were coming to talk to them about what they were involved in. So this is the kind of atmosphere that we were dealing with down here.
At the same time, police canvass Pamela's family, looking for leads and potential suspects.
Most murders, the victim knows the suspect and the suspect knows the victim, so you have to start in the inner circle and work your way out.
Within that inner circle, a name pops up, that of 38-year-old Lenny Hall. Lenny is apparently Pamela's most recent boyfriend and no stranger to physical violence.
Police learned that Pamela George was living common law with a man named Lenny Hall. They also received information from some of her relatives suggesting that Pamela had complained to them about domestic violence and that she was trying to get away from Mr. Hall. And further, the autopsy revealed that she had bruises on her person that seemed to be somewhat older, suggesting that they had been inflicted prior to this particular crime.
On the evening 18th, we went to his residence. Visually, we were looking for any signs of scars on him. We didn't notice any. He was upset, kept saying, why her, why her?
Lenny explains that he and Pamela were still seeing one another, but claims he had nothing to do with her murder.
The relationship between Pamela and Lenny, I think, could be described as a volatile one. When asked about it, Lenny Hall told police that a short time before the incident, they had had a fight which became physical. He got 2 black eyes, she got 1 black eye, and as a result of that altercation, she left him for approximately a week. She did not have a pimp. She worked independently and primarily worked to supply her drug habit. He indicated that she would do 2 or sometimes 3 tricks a night. Her preferred customers were older Caucasian men, and she preferred not to go with Aboriginal men.
He also says that he and Pamela had recently robbed a number of her clients and suggests her murder might be some kind of payback.
The police had learned during the course of the investigation that Pamela and Lenny Hall would sometimes rip off her customers. She would arrange a meeting with someone, he would pay her for her services, and she would leave, and then Lenny would intervene and essentially tell the customer that Pamela wasn't coming back and he wasn't getting his money back and get rid of him.
Lenny Hall also admits to seeing Pamela on the very night she was murdered.
He told us that on that night, Pam was turning tricks on a street corner, and he happened to be in the basement of a house across the street, and he could see her from the corner. He said about 12:30, he observed her getting into a vehicle with an older gentleman who he believed that she'd been with before, a man by the name of Tony. At 2 o'clock, she hadn't returned to where she should have been. He got worried. He went out and started searching the downtown core 4, and at 6 o'clock, he still hadn't found her. And that's the story he gave us.
While keeping Lenny Hall as a person of interest, police immediately head out to interview Pamela's regular client, Tony, perhaps the last person to see her alive. They soon learn of another suspicious vehicle cruising the inner city streets the night of the murder. Driver unknown. The mystery car may have been Pamela's last ride. Trying to solve the murder of 28-year-old Pamela George, police move through Regina's inner city, a high crime area next to downtown. Since Pamela often worked on the streets, her killer may have come from the shady world of men who cruise the area after dark in search of sex. Police are soon at the doorstep of a man named Tony, a client of Pamela's who allegedly saw her shortly before she was killed.
Tony was described as a Caucasian male. He was in his early 60s. He worked shift work. He lived near a school. He was someone who liked young girls and would frequent the stroll as a customer. He had an ongoing relationship with Pamela George. They had had sex together several times as a customer. He would take her out for dinner. He would visit her. And in fact, on the night she was murdered, he had been described as the last person who had been seen with her. But he denied that he was involved in that in any way. The police followed up their investigation by searching Tony's house. They looked at his car. They found a scarf in his car, but he said that belonged to another woman.
Police feel that Tony is likely telling the truth and that Pamela may have been killed by another John who picked her up sometime between 1 and 2 a.m., shortly after Tony dropped her off and before her boyfriend Lenny Hall noticed she was missing.
I think that the assumption was that Pamela was picked up in the downtown area, and perhaps one of the other street workers saw her communicating with somebody or get in somebody's vehicle, so we reached out to the public to see if we could stir any of that information up.
At the same time, a memorial service is held for Pamela back on the Sakamay First Nation where she grew up.
After the day that Pam passed away, there was a couple eagles out in the sky and just flying around, figuring that they were helping us, watching over us. And we were trying to figure out what really happened to my girl, and to me, the eagles were watching over us and trying to tell us something.
While a community mourns, the best resource for police remains the women on the street and a society that works with them to help keep them safe. But getting their assistance takes time, given the nature of their work.
We weren't getting a lot of assistance or leads from the girls or the society who work with the girls. That was because the girls obviously the society don't want to lose the trust of the girls by working with the police, and therefore it felt like we were beating our heads against the walls.
Police are particularly interested in something known as a bad trick list, an informal list of all the violent or abusive clients that women encounter on the street.
They know who's out there, and they recognize the people that come back again. They talk amongst themselves and pass the information on, and eventually they get reported.
The identities of bad tricks are carefully guarded, but in the interest of preventing another attack on those still out on the street, police are soon given a number of names.
We got the list, and from that, we went to everybody that was named on the list. From that, we asked them, who are you? What were you doing? Where were you? And from that, we tried to determine if they had anything to do with the death of Pamela George.
One name on the list leads them to a farmer living in a nearby town.
He was described as someone who frequented the stroll in Regina. He had previously been charged with the offense of assault causing bodily harm. He was being investigated for suspected involvement with a 13-year-old prostitute. He drove a half-ton truck and had a common-law spouse and was suspected of abusing her daughters.
Over the next few days, police contact numerous bad tricks. In each case, they check alibis and examine vehicles and tire treads to compare them with the treads found at the crime scene.
There were 2 or 3 names that did come up as bad tricks, and we did interview them a couple of times. We tried to clear them. I'm not sure if we believe everything they told us, and that's about as far as it went.
The bad trick list yields a cast of unsavory characters, but no clear suspects. Back in the inner city, however, a striking new lead materializes. It comes from a woman named Charlene, who was also working the streets the night Pamela was killed.
We'd been down there a couple of nights, and we come across a girl named Charlene who was working on one of the corners. We wanted to know if she had been working that night and if she'd seen anything suspicious or had any information she could pass on about what had happened. She said actually there was. She said she recalls 2 young white males in a white car approached her and wanted to go with them. And she said, no, I don't do that. I don't go with 2 people. So they left. About a half an hour later, she says she's seen the same vehicle parked in a back alley, the same 2 males, and one of the males was getting into the trunk of the car. The vehicle left, came back to her again a few minutes later, and again asked her to go with the one driver, and she said, no, I know what you guys are up to, and she wouldn't go, so the vehicle left. We asked this girl if she thought she could identify these people again, and she said she thought she could, and she agreed to come down to the RCMP detachment and meet with a forensic artist who could do a drawing of the people she saw in the vehicle.
The drawing produced by Charlene and the sketch artist is a rendition of one of the 2 men, the one driving the car the second time they approached Charlene. Given their behavior that night, the driver and his friend are clear persons of interest.
It seemed like suspicious activity. It wasn't normal that someone would get into the trunk of a car and try and pick somebody up again. When we heard this, we thought we were maybe onto something, and something that we could use in our investigation.
Seeking the identity of the 2 mysterious men becomes a focal point of the investigation. And a shady convict in the local prison seems to know far more than he is letting on about what happened to Pamela Jean George. A week has passed since the badly beaten body of 28-year-old Pamela George turned up in a ditch near the city airport. As a sex trade worker, Pamela spent time with a client named Tony shortly before her death. Her boyfriend Lenny Hall is another person of interest, as are a few bad tricks known to frequent the downtown core. But a new tip reveals that 2 suspicious young men were also cruising the streets that night, taking turns hiding in the trunk of their car to avoid intimidating the women they were trying to pick up. But beyond a composite sketch of one of the men, police have little else to go on. Along with the RCMP, who are leading the investigation, local Regina City Police are also on the lookout for a break in the case. With a killer on the loose, fear and rumor are rampant, particularly amongst the women still working the streets near downtown.
Well, when I was talking to one of the girls on the street, she said that she had heard that an incident similar to this one had happened before, although the girl was able to get away and she wasn't harmed. This, however, we could not confirm. If we had brought somebody in for any reason at all, we would make a habit of going into the cell block to interview these people to see if they knew anything about the Pamela George murder. When you're talking to street people, they know what's going on as well as a rule on the street, and we thought we may be able to get some information from these people.
9 days after the crime, one such tip leads police to a career criminal named Edwin Lloyd Isaac. There is a rumor on the street that he may have been involved in Pamela's death. Although currently behind bars, Isaac was free the week of the murder. He also has a rocky past with Pamela as a former boyfriend and possibly pimp.
Lloyd Isaac was described as a pimp who worked in the Stroll in Regina. One of Pamela's relatives suggested that she may have been considering moving in with him. He was also described as being very controlling and that everyone was afraid of him.
We attended the correctional center at 11:30 in the morning. He was being held on one of the ranges. He was brought to an interview area where we went in and interviewed him.
Isaac denies any involvement in the crime and explains that the killer was likely a client, a bad trick.
He said that there was no bad blood between him and Pamela George, and that while he may have been a pimp in the past, he was no longer involved in that type of operation. He said he last saw Pam about 10 or 11 p.m. the night before she was killed, and that the police were barking up the wrong tree, and that he felt the suspect was a bad John.
Isaac explains that he doesn't have a car of his own, but often borrows one belonging to his roommate Jason. He admits he borrowed the car on 3 different occasions that week, but claims he was at home asleep at the time of the murder.
He's someone who's been around the block before and dealt with the police. He said he didn't do it. I didn't know if I could trust him at the time.
Police follow up on Isaac's alibi. His roommate Jason confirms that he did see Isaac asleep on the couch shortly before midnight on the night of the murder. By morning, Isaac had moved to his bed, but Jason has no idea whether he might have left the house at some point. His car did not appear to have been moved. Police examine the car closely. Although the tire treads don't match those at the crime scene, they do find a naturally shed hair inside that is consistent with Pamela's hair. They also confiscate Isaac's clothing, looking for more evidence and perhaps a footwear match. The shoe prints found at the scene have now been determined to have come from a model of Nike hiking shoe. But beyond the hair in the car, they come up empty-handed.
Initially, when asked to take the polygraph, Lloyd Isaac said he would as long as his lawyer could be present. But later, again, when asked by police, he refused to do so, saying that he had taken one before and failed. He also told police there was nothing to connect him to Pamela's murder.
Then, just as the cast of potential suspects keeps growing, a startling new tip comes in to Regina City Police.
I was working in robbery homicide, and I was advised by the dispatcher that a call had come from a girl in Vancouver who stated that she knew something about the homicide at the airport. She was visibly upset, crying on the phone. She eventually told me that the first names were Steve and Alex of the 2 people. However, she did not know their last names.
The girl claims that a few weeks earlier, shortly after the crime, she was told a story about what went on that night. The 2 men are actually her brother's friends. She's been too afraid to call police until now.
Said that she had heard that Steve and Alex had been out drinking at a bar and then split a 40-ounce of whiskey. Then Alex got into the trunk of the vehicle and they picked up a girl and took her out to the airport. she gave Steve oral sex, and while she was giving Alex oral sex, Steve pulled him off and hit him, and then they ended up beating up the girl and dragging her face down, and then they left her there.
The mystery duo and their use of the trunk of the car as a hiding place sounds like the same pair of men portrayed in the composite drawing. Although the young girl providing the latest tip insists she only knows the two men as Steve and Alex and doesn't know their last names, Detective Collins is soon speaking with someone who does know, that being the younger girl's brother.
He was reluctant to give me any information about them, as he was afraid of any reprisals from the two, and also what his friends would think if he ratted them out. Over the next 2 days, I had several conversations with both him and his father, trying to find out the last names of these two boys.
Detective Collins eventually secures the full names of the suspects. Their identities shock the public, and the story they weave ignites new controversy about the murder of Pamela George. Police investigating the murder of Pamela George have received a tip regarding two young men who have apparently admitted to friends that they picked up and beat a prostitute the same night of the crime. Known initially by their first names only, Stephen and Alex, further research and calls with the tipster's family eventually identifies them as 19-year-old Alex Czernowetzki and 18-year-old Stephen Comerfield. Stephen Comerfield is a well-known basketball star at the local university. Alex is the son of a former professor at the same establishment. Unlike most suspects in the case, they come from established white upper-middle-class families. Looking to bolster the tip, police reapproach Charlene, the woman who helped put together a composite drawing of two men who tried to pick her up the same night.
After Comerfield and Czernowetzki's name surfaced, I prepared a photo lineup, and I included Alex Czernowetzki's picture in the lineup. The lineup included 10 photographs. There were people of similar age, similar size, hair color. She immediately pointed to a picture of Alex Czernowetzki and said he was the guy that was in the white car.
Police learned that Alex Czernowetzki is currently in British Columbia, where he went for a summer job. But Stephen Comerfield is staying at his mother's place in Regina.
I vividly remember going to Stephen Comerfield's house, and we made the arrest. And when we get there, he grabs his shoes, ties them up on top of the stairs outside the house. And there's no emotion, no feeling, no comments made by him or anything. I just found it really, really odd that here's this prominent basketball star from the University of Regina, 18, 19 years old, well known in the community as far as I know, and no reaction. I suspect that he knew we were coming for him and he had prepared himself for that day.
After identifying Alex, eyewitness Charlene gets a glimpse of Stephen the following day.
The next morning, Charlene was walking down the street and she passed the newsstand and she seen a local newspaper on the stand with a picture of a person on it that she recognized. She phoned me immediately after seeing it, and she said that's the same person that was in the car when they tried to pick her up. The picture on the newspaper that morning was Stephen Comerfield, and that seemed to seal it. That was the two guys that tried to pick her up before Pam George was murdered.
But police know that second-hand accounts of the boys' actions will not be enough to secure a conviction in court. Seeking hard physical evidence, they move in with search warrants. At Stephen Comerfield's father's home, they impound the car allegedly used in the crime.
When I presented the search warrant to his father and he was advised of what happened, he went pale. I thought he was going to have a heart attack. I actually sat him down on the kitchen chair and to calm him down.
I remember going to the Cumberfield residence and going to Stephen's bedroom to do the search. His room was a mess. There were clothes all over the place, and it was just a typical teenage kid's room. I went right to the closet, and as I was flipping up some of the clothes in the closet, I found a box top to a Nike pair of runners. And right away I knew this was good because we knew that there was a Nike brand foot impression found at the scene. We hadn't recovered any of his shoes yet, so we knew that this was potential evidence that was really good.
Although the shoes themselves are nowhere to be found, the car becomes a focal point of the investigation back at the forensics lab. When photographed and measured, the tire treads are an exact match to those left on the road near Pamela George's body. More evidence turns up inside.
I was with Steve Pike, who was in our biology section, and Herb Carruthers, who was a forensic ident guy at the time. And we searched the vehicle, and we found things like a fleece top, roll of paper towels. But really what the majority of the exhibits we see were hairs. Steve was down on his hands and knees with tweezers, lights, picking off hairs all over the back seat of the car and all within the interior of the car.
At least 4 hairs discovered in the car appear to be consistent with those of Pamela George. 3 of the 4 hairs contain roots, meaning they were forcibly removed.
If Pamela George's hair is in the car, when was she in that car? Why was she in that car? And it's pretty significant evidence when you couple it with everything else that's going on in the investigation.
Local authorities in British Columbia soon tracked down second suspect Alex Czerniewski near the remote northern city of Prince George. Like Stephen Cumberfield, he is charged with first-degree murder.
I printed and photographed Alex Czerniewski, and I just found with him, both him and Stephen Cumberfield, they're both very cocky individuals. Young kids, 18, 19 years old, been arrested for murder, charged. They didn't seem to care much about it. They showed no emotion, and that struck me as very odd. I know for myself, had I been picked up for a murder, I'd be genuinely concerned, and there was no concern from them at all.
As the news spreads, the arrests shocked local residents.
I think everybody was surprised at what had happened. Here you had 2 young kids who were involved in a homicide. One was a prominent basketball star at the University of Regina. They both came from fairly affluent families, well-educated, yet they've been involved in something like this. It was a shock to the entire community.
The city's divided. There are those people who think, well, you know, good kids can do bad things, so if they did this, I hope they get what's coming to them. And then there's the other camp, people who think, well, these are good kids from a good neighborhood, they're going to university, they don't do things like this, the police must have the wrong guys.
For Pamela's mother, Ina, there is relief that her daughter's killers may finally be in custody.
Like, I was kind of shocked to hear that there was these 2 boys from a wealthy family, whatever. Like, why did they have to do that then, you know? The Eagles left when they found the last guy. To me, I think the Eagles were looking after us.
To bolster their growing physical evidence in the case, authorities also approach a number of Alex and Steve's close friends who they apparently confided in about the crime, friends who have so far kept quiet.
They were white young men from middle-class homes. They had met Stephen or Alex through sports or through school. Many of them were still going to school. They were afraid to testify in court. I had to meet with them several times to explain to them their obligations, to convince them to come to court and tell the truth, that this wasn't just a basketball prank. It was a very serious matter involving the death of a woman, and it couldn't be covered up.
Alex in particular made numerous boastful declarations following the crime, claiming that he and Stephen had gotten drunk, taken turns hiding in the trunk of their car, picked up a prostitute, and then beat her on a remote road.
It seemed that in the hours and days after the incident took place, both Stephen and Alex told several of their friends and acquaintances about what had happened. They did so without seeming to realize the impact it had on their friends, many of whom were shocked by the story.
As the 2 men head to court, there is a charged atmosphere, one that has spilled over into a city characterized by predominantly white middle-class suburbs and a lower income, mostly Aboriginal core.
I think the case was shocking because of the contrast between the boys who were charged with the offense, who were white, middle-class boys from good homes, and the victim, who was a First Nations woman, a sex trade worker on the fringes of society, who had very few opportunities in life. It brought up the issue of race in the city of Regina and in our province, and that became a theme that underlay the entire case.
When the trial began, this was, again, big news, because you had two young men who, by all accounts, had great futures ahead of them, and they were looking at life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years, because the Crown and police had a good case for first-degree murder.
But what appears like a rock-solid case will get derailed in court. There is talk of another killer still at large, and the jury's verdict catches almost everyone off guard. 19 months after their arrest, Alex Chernowitzki and Stephen Comerfield stand trial for the murder of 28-year-old Pamela George, an Aboriginal woman they allegedly picked up off the street in Regina's inner-city core and beat to death on a remote road. The nature of the case draws national media coverage.
It was tense in the community during the trial. There were demonstrations. They were protesting. I think they very much saw this as a racial issue. You had two sort of well-off fellows from Caucasian families who'd kind of stepped into Pam's world, and that world was poor and it was Aboriginal.
Inside the packed courtroom, Pamela George's mother gets to see those accused of killing her daughter face to face.
I was angry. Like, why did you do this to my girl, you know? Why did it have to take two of you?
The evidence against the pair seems overwhelming. Not only did they admit to friends that they had picked up and beaten a prostitute, but tire tracks from their vehicle match those found near Pamela George's body. Even more damning, DNA testing proves that the hair found inside the car they were driving matches the victim. As the trial moves forward, both of the accused take the stand. They admit to the court that on the night in question, they drank heavily and headed into the downtown core in search of a prostitute, each taking a turn hiding in the trunk so as not to intimidate the women they were trying to pick up. Alex was in the trunk and Steve was driving when they finally picked up Pamela George. When they reached the outskirts of the city, Alex emerged from the trunk, surprising and upsetting Pamela. Both men say they took turns engaging in sexual activity with Pamela before pulling her out of the car and attacking her, beating and kicking her. But the men claim that Pamela was alive when they left and even walked after them down the road as they drove away, yelling at them. In light of the boys' testimony, the defense then makes an incredible argument, suggesting that another suspect could have arrived afterwards, inflicting the final blows that killed Pamela George. That other person might have been Pamela's boyfriend, Lenny Hall, or one-time suspect, Edwin Lloyd Isaac.
They suggested that some third party may have done that, and as such, were trying to raise a reasonable doubt.
The defense also brings in their own pathologist, who argues that Pamela may not have died from bleeding in the brain, but from other causes after the boys left.
And if that was the case, then that meant that they didn't intentionally kill her, but that it could have been an unintentional death, that she might have died of hypothermia or choking on her own vomit, which would have made it manslaughter, not murder.
In the end, the defense calls for an outright acquittal if the jury thinks another person killed Pamela, or manslaughter if they think she died not from, but after the attack. In the Canadian legal system, a second-degree murder charge automatically becomes a first-degree murder charge when there is proof of sexual assault or forcible confinement. But as the trial winds down, the judge makes a controversial charge to the jury. He explains that because Pamela was a prostitute, sexual assault or confinement don't necessarily apply, as she willingly engaged in sexual activity in a remote location. The comments sparked outrage in the community.
I think that was shocking, probably for the jurors, and it was shocking for everybody else.
I think part of the problem was that Pam got into a vehicle not knowing there were two men in that car because one was hiding in the trunk. The other thing was they beat her in the course of those sex acts. That's what the two men testified to. So it was sort of for the jury to decide how consensual that act was. There was also implicit in that a suggestion that somehow she was a second-class citizen and wasn't sort of equal to the same protection of the law.
I didn't like what he said, and to bear in mind that Pamela was a prostitute. Sure, Pamela might have been a prostitute, but she was a human being.
After a 6-week trial, the jury retreats to deliberate. 1 day later, they return.
It was making national headlines, I think, because of the people that were involved. I recall there was media there from outside of this city.
The jury finds the two men guilty, but of the lesser charge of manslaughter.
Like, I was shocked because they were charged at first degree in the first place, you know, and why didn't they stick with it?
Obviously, it wasn't the verdict that we had wanted, but the Crown has to accept the decision of the court. I felt primarily bad for the family because I think they perceived the verdict as devaluing Pamela's life.
There was a sense that some injustice had happened, that you had these two fellows who were white, who'd picked up this poor Aboriginal woman, who'd taken her out of the city and killed her. And I think there was a feeling in some quarters that there should have been a different verdict, that it should have been murder and not manslaughter.
Although the two young men are convicted on the charges of manslaughter only, they receive the harshest penalty possible for the offense, 10 years. For the family of Pamela George, it's a small price to pay for such a devastating crime.
To me, like, they took my mom. I never knew my mom. No. Like, I have children and she just never got to see them.
In the wake of the trial, there are demands for reforms to the judicial system. A judicial system many Aboriginals feel treats them unfairly. But also troubling to many is the fact that the crime came very close to never being solved, despite so many people knowing about it.
There's a very good chance that these two guys never would have been caught, despite the fact they'd talked to their friends about what had happened and in very grisly detail about what had happened and what he had done. Despite that, none of those friends went to the police. Not one, not a single one went to tell the police what they knew about that crime. And it was only because one of their friend's sisters had overheard a conversation and decided to go to the police that these two guys were even on the radar.
The divide between the two young men and their victim kept them well hidden, but it also gave birth to the arrogance that was their eventual undoing.
What sunk them in this case was their own bravado and bragging about it to their friends. The police are lucky that that happens, because if it wasn't for that arrogance, that stupidity on behalf of the criminals, it'd be a lot harder to catch them.